December 20th, 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snowflakes whipped against the jagged pine trunks, sharp and icy, stinging exposed faces. The wind groaned through the trees, carrying the distant, guttural rumble of German tanks. You can almost feel it, the anticipation, the fear, and the sense that something is about to snap. Corporal James "Jimmy" Callahan squinted through frozen goggles, kneeling beside a Sherman tank half buried in a drift. Its treads were twisted, engine dead, and the air reeked of scorched metal and diesel. Around him, dozens of tanks lay frozen in the mud, silent hulks waiting for someone to breathe life back into them. The rest of his unit huddled in the shadows, weapons ready, boots crunching over ice, waiting for dawn that seemed endless. Above them, the German artillery rattled the night sky in sudden bursts. Trees shuddered. Metal groaned. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with static, the tense voice of a lieutenant reporting, "Call Mercer, the armored column is stalled. 40 tanks out of action. We can't hold the line." Callahan's hands were raw, blackened from handling frozen scrap metal and rigging makeshift repairs. He wasn't an officer, not a strategist, not a hero in the history books, just a garage mechanic, a humble ordnance sergeant who could weld, patch, and improvise under pressure. And tonight, in the middle of chaos, he was the Army's last hope. He crouched beneath the Sherman, feeling the cold bite through his gloves, sparks flying from his torch. Each flicker of light danced across the cracked metal, revealing deep dents, ripped armor plates, and a destroyed transmission. Every second counted. Every clank of steel on steel echoed like a heartbeat across the silent forest. Somewhere behind him, Private Thompson muttered, "Think it can be done, Jimmy?" Callahan didn't answer. He just stared at the lifeless machine, inhaled the diesel fumes, and whispered under his breath, "It has to be." Because if he failed, if those 40 tanks stayed dead until daylight, the line could collapse. Entire towns could fall to the German blitz. Soldiers could die while waiting for a miracle, and that miracle had to come from him. Then a distant sound cut through the storm, the unmistakable rumble of approaching German armor, not far, too close. And Callahan knew, whatever he did tonight, it had to work before the first shell hit. Callahan's breath steamed in the icy air as he surveyed the wreckage. 40 Shermans lay like wounded beasts across the forest floor, tracks ripped apart, turrets jammed, engines silent. Some were scorched black from shell hits, others were simply frozen solid, metal stiff with frost. The thought of repairing them all seemed absurd, insane, impossible. But impossibility had a way of fatting in the Ardennes at night. He pulled a small roll of welding wire from his pack, the edges of his gloves scraping against cold steel as he looped it through jagged holes. Sparks leapt like fireflies against the dark, illuminating the jagged scars of battle. Nearby, soldiers scavenged twisted scrap, panels, brackets, old engine parts to hand to him. Every piece mattered. Every inch of metal was a chance at life. Callahan moved from tank to tank, working alone, improvising like a field surgeon stitching together a shattered body. He rigged a transmission with leftover gears, welded panels over holes big enough to swallow a man, and jury-rigged tracks with chains pilfered from other vehicles. His hands were blistered, cut, bleeding, but he didn't stop. Every clang of metal against metal felt like a countdown. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Only the distant rattle of artillery reminded them that the Germans were out there, testing the resolve of men and machines alike. "Got another one," shouted Thompson, holding a spare sprocket. Callahan grabbed it without looking up, welding it into place like a surgeon threading bone into a fracture. The tank shuddered under his torch, a mechanical heartbeat returning to life. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't perfect, it was survival. And with each tank resurrected, a spark of hope grew, both in the machines and in the men watching. But time was bleeding away. Every minute spent on repairs was a minute closer to the German push. He could almost hear the enemy laughing in the shadows, daring them to fail. And deep down, Callahan knew, tonight, failure wasn't an option. Then a low, metallic groan echoed from the far side of the clearing. Not artillery, not the wind. Something alive, something moving. The groan grew louder. Callahan froze, eyes narrowing through the frost-laced goggles. The shadow of a German half-track loomed between the skeletal trees, headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. Somewhere down the line, a Sherman's engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. The sound was small, but it was a signal. Callahan's hands didn't stop. Sparks flew as he tightened a jury-rigged track. Sweat mingled with the freezing snow on his brow. Every clang and hiss of the torch was a heartbeat, and the forest seemed to pulse with it. He moved like a man possessed, patching armor with whatever scrap he could find, cannibalizing damaged tanks to repair others. "Jimmy, that one's ready," shouted Thompson, breath ragged, voice cracking in the cold. Callahan swung around. Another Sherman's engine sputtered and coughed, then roared into life. The turret rotated, the main gun tracking an invisible enemy in the darkness. For a second, the impossible felt real. 40 tanks, or at least 30 of them now, could move by dawn. 30 lives, 30 chances, 30 sparks of hope. But the German push was relentless. The sound of artillery shells rolling through the trees grew closer. Shadows flitted across the snow, figures in field gray moving with terrifying precision. Each second that passed made the difference between holding the line or watching it crumble. Callahan glanced at his hands, blackened, raw, bleeding. The welding torch sputtered, then flared back to life. He tightened a panel over a Sherman's damaged engine compartment and listened. The metal creaked, groaned, but it held. Another heartbeat returned to the armored column. Then came the realization: the line could survive. If he could keep going, if he could keep improvising, if he could push the impossible just a little further. And yet, as he worked, he knew there were still 10 tanks out cold and the Germans were closing in, midnight. The snow had turned into a fine mist, coating the tanks in a slick layer of ice. Callahan's hands were shaking, not from cold but from exhaustion, the kind that grips your bones and whispers that you can't go on. Yet he moved from one disabled Sherman to the next, welding, tightening, improvising, his eyes burning from the sparks and the effort. Nearby, Private Thompson whispered, almost in awe, "How are you doing this just with scraps?" Callahan didn't answer. He didn't have to. Every tank that roared back to life was his answer. Each one was a statement against impossibility, against the freezing darkness, against the enemy waiting to tear the line apart. One by one, the engines coughed and spat fire into the night. The groan of metal gave way to a chorus of life as 30, then 35 Shermans lurched forward, treads crunching snow, turrets swinging, guns ready. The soldiers could feel it, hope bubbling like fire beneath the frost. But there was one final test. A Sherman in the middle of the clearing, completely mangled, tracks torn off, turret jammed, engine dead as stone. Every other tank depended on it to hold the column together. If this one didn't move, the line risked splitting, leaving men exposed. Callahan approached it, welding torch in hand, scavenged parts dangling from his pack. The forest seemed to hush. Even the wind paused as if holding its breath. He looked at the broken beast and muttered under his breath, "Let's see what you've got." Hours passed like minutes. Sparks flew, metal twisted, and wires were connected with hands that trembled from cold and fatigue. Then, a cough from the engine, a wheeze of pistons struggling against frozen oil, and finally, a roar that split the night. The last Sherman moved. The column was whole again, every tank operational, every gun ready, every soldier's hope renewed. Callahan stepped back, chest heaving, sweat and snow dripping from his face. But his relief was cut short by a distant sound, a German artillery shell crashing somewhere in the trees. They weren't out of danger. Not yet. By 4:30 a.m., the first pale light of dawn seeped through the skeletal Ardennes trees, casting long shadows across the snow-strewn battlefield. The cold was brutal, biting at the soldiers' faces and stiffening the treads of tanks that had only just come back to life. But despite the frost and fatigue, the sound of engines, low, steady, defiant, filled the forest. 40 Shermans, 39 now fully operational, their crews ready to move to fight to survive. Callahan wiped soot and ice from his face and looked across the line. Soldiers whispered his name with a mix of disbelief and awe. He did it, he actually did it. Murmurs carried over the frozen ground, spreading like wildfire. Men who had feared the collapse of their armored column now grinned, fists pounding snow and steel, ready to meet the coming German push. At the edge of the clearing, Lieutenant Mercer's voice came through the radio, tense but incredulous. "Callahan, the column, it's moving. How the hell?" Callahan allowed himself a rare smile, exhaustion heavy in his bones, but the danger was far from over. Beyond the trees, the enemy was massing, unaware that 40 tanks, reborn from scrap and sweat, were about to face them. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the miracle of the night could turn into victory. Every Sherman, every welded patch, every improvised gear and panel was now more than metal, it was defiance. Against the odds, against the cold, against time itself. And for the first time that night, the U.S. armored column could hope not just to survive, but to strike back. But even as engines rumbled and soldiers clambered into positions, Callahan knew the truth. They had only delayed disaster, not defeated it. And somewhere in the dark, the Germans were moving, unaware that the very garage mechanic they would have dismissed had just changed the course of a battle with nothing but fire, metal, and unyielding determination. By 6:00 a.m., the frost-coated Ardennes was alive with movement. The Shermans, now fully operational, rumbled like a single, relentless beast. Their engines steamed in the cold morning air, tracks biting into snow, as soldiers climbed into turrets and radio operators called coordinates to the front lines. Callahan watched from the edge of the clearing, welding gloves still in hand, sparks clinging to his coat. Around him, soldiers whispered, awed, "Did you see the last one? It came to life like nothing happened." Across the ridge, German forces were advancing, unaware that the silent, frozen hulks they had assumed useless were now ready. Artillery shells screamed overhead, ricocheting off distant trees, and the sharp report of rifles and machine guns echoed from hidden positions. But the line was no longer faltering. It was breathing, moving, and waiting. Callahan signaled to Lieutenant Mercer, "We push now, keep them off balance." The Shermans surged forward, a metallic tide of fury and resilience. Shells slammed into the frozen ground, and yet the repaired tanks held firm. Men who had spent the night shivering in despair now shouted, fired, and maneuvered as though reborn with their machines. The forest trembled under the power of 40 tanks moving in unison, an armored column resurrected from scrap and willpower. Amid the chaos, Callahan moved from tank to tank, checking welds, tightening improvised panels, adjusting cannibalized engines. Each vehicle was a testament to his work, each roar of its engine a heartbeat of defiance against the enemy. Somewhere along the ridge, a German officer looked through binoculars and froze. His unit was advancing into what they had believed was an easy kill zone. Instead, 40 Shermans, alive and ready, rolled toward them like thunder incarnate. Shock, disbelief, panic, emotions rippled through their ranks. They had expected ruin. Instead, they faced a force that had risen from the ashes of its own destruction. And in that moment, Callahan realized something. His night's work hadn't just saved tanks. It had saved men, held the line, and bought precious hours, hours that could change the course of the battle itself. But the forest was not yet silent. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, a larger German force was regrouping. They hadn't been defeated, they were coming. The sun was fully up now, pale and weak through the lingering mist. The Shermans rolled steadily along the Ardennes road, engines puffing white clouds into the freezing morning. Soldiers laughed, shouted, and clapped each other on the back, relief mingled with adrenaline. But Callahan's face remained grim, eyes scanning the horizon. Every improvised repair carried a cost. Welds might hold under current conditions, but stress from continued firing could tear them apart. A missing bolt here, a jury-rigged track there, Anyone who underestimated the fragility of his work could pay with their life. He knew it, and he felt the weight of it. These tanks were alive, but only just. Thompson ran up to him, breath steaming. "Sergeant, the column's holding. They're actually holding." Callahan gave a short nod, a mix of exhaustion and quiet pride. His hands were cut, blackened, muscles screaming. Every movement reminded him that survival tonight had not been free. Every spark, every stolen scrap, every improvised part had demanded sweat and blood. Meanwhile, German shells fell near the outskirts of the forest, shaking snow from branches and rattling loose panels on patched tanks. But the armored column pressed on, a testament to human ingenuity under fire. Officers and enlisted men alike began to whisper stories that would later reach back home, about the mechanic who made impossible possible, who turned despair into action with nothing but scrap, sweat, and determination. Yet in the back of Callahan's mind lingered a gnawing thought. The battle wasn't over. The Ardennes had already claimed the careless, the unprepared, and the unlucky. Each repair, each improvised weld was a temporary reprieve. They had survived the night, but dawn had brought new challenges: German counterattacks, artillery barrages, and a forest full of men willing to die to reclaim lost ground. And somewhere deep inside him, Callahan wondered, how many of these tanks, how many of these men could truly survive until the next night? By late morning, the Ardennes clearing was alive with movement and noise. The repaired Shermans lumbering forward, soldiers shouting commands, and the occasional whistle of distant artillery. Yet amid the organized chaos, one figure moved quietly between machines, inspecting welds, checking bolts, ensuring that each tank remained battle-ready. That figure was Sergeant James Callahan, the garage mechanic who, by sheer will and ingenuity, had kept 40 tanks alive through the night. Officers approached him cautiously, almost reverently. Lieutenant Mercer clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Jimmy, you've saved more than machines. You've saved this line. You've saved lives." Callahan shrugged, brushing soot from his coat, eyes scanning the horizon. "Just doing my job," he muttered. But the truth was undeniable. In a battle where every hour counted, where frozen engines and shattered armor could decide the fate of entire units, his work had tipped the balance. The soldiers he had saved knew it. They talked about him in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might make him vanish. Every Sherman that rumbled, every turret that swung into action, was a testament to his improvisation, his creativity, and his relentless courage. Far beyond the Ardennes, stories began to spread. Messengers carried word of the sergeant who could make dead machines roar back to life. It wasn't a tale of glory or medals. It wasn't about strategic genius or battlefield heroics in the traditional sense. It was about resilience, improvisation, and the extraordinary impact one man could have in the midst of chaos. And as the column pushed forward, Callahan finally allowed himself a moment to breathe, watching the sun glint off patched armor and snow-streaked guns. In that moment, the impossible had become reality. One man, one night, 40 tanks, alive, moving, and ready to fight. The Ardennes would never forget. But somewhere deep in the German lines, commanders were adjusting their plans, shocked to find 40 Shermans where they had expected ruin. And in that realization, the tide of the battle itself began to shift. By mid-afternoon. The full impact of Callahan's night work began to reveal itself. The repaired Shermans were no longer just a line of survival, they were a spearhead. With 40 tanks moving in coordinated advance, the U.S. armored column regained momentum. Enemy reconnaissance units reported unexpected resistance. German officers scratched notes in disbelief. Where did they get these tanks? How are they still operational? Callahan moved alongside the lead Sherman, listening to the low hum of engines and the rhythmic crunch of treads over frozen mud. Each tank that rumbled forward was a story, a defiance of the impossible. Soldiers clung to their guns, scanning the woods for movement, confidence building with each step. The morale boost was palpable. Men who had hours earlier huddled in despair now stood taller, voices louder, hands steadier. The ripple effect extended beyond the Ardennes clearing. Communications from headquarters confirmed that a stalled armored column farther north had been reinforced in time, preventing a potential German breakthrough. Every mile the repaired tanks advanced bought precious time for artillery to reposition, infantry to reorganize, and supply lines to stabilize. One man's work, one long, freezing night of improvisation, had shifted the battle in real time. And yet Callahan remained focused, silent, almost invisible amid the mechanical symphony he had orchestrated. He wasn't a hero seeking recognition. He was a mechanic, a sergeant, a man who understood that in war, survival often depended on grit, skill, and the refusal to surrender to impossibility. But as the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor, he knew the Ardennes would test them again. The Germans would regroup, counterattack, and push. And when they did, every welded panel, every cannibalized part, every spark of ingenuity would be tested once more. Night began to creep back over the Ardennes, softening the harsh outlines of tanks and trees into shadowy silhouettes. The repaired Shermans had held the line all day, their engines humming a low, steady tune of defiance. Soldiers shuffled along the column, checking ammo, repairing minor damages, and whispering stories of Sergeant Callahan, the man who had breathed life into metal when the line was on the verge of collapse. Callahan himself sat on the edge of a flattened snowbank, hands blackened and swollen, eyes heavy but alert. He stared at the column, each tank a monument to improvisation and resilience. The forest was silent now, only the distant echo of artillery far behind them, a lull, temporary and deceptive, as if the Ardennes itself had paused to witness the night's miracle. A young private approached, hesitant. "Sir, do you really think we can hold them tomorrow?" Callahan didn't answer immediately. He studied the tanks, the soldiers, the frozen battlefield stretching into darkness. Then he said, softly but firmly, "We survived tonight. That means we can survive tomorrow. And we'll keep moving, one tank at a time, one repair at a time until we push them back." The private nodded, hope rekindled. Around them, the column's lights flickered in the growing darkness, shadows dancing across patched steel and snow-streaked treads. The impossible had been done once. It could be done again. As Callahan lay back briefly, listening to the engine's steady rumble, a thought struck him. The Ardennes would remember this night. Not because of strategy or medals, but because of sheer determination. 40 tanks resurrected, 40 chances at survival, and one man's refusal to let impossibility win. But somewhere beyond the forest, the Germans were regrouping, plotting, preparing to test every welded panel and improvised engine once more. And Callahan, weary but unbroken, knew that when the next storm came, he would be ready.